The classroom was still, the faint hum of the air conditioner barely audible. Sunlight filtered through dusty blinds, casting uneven stripes across the rows of desks. Malik Johnson sat near the back, his head bowed over his notebook. His pencil hovered above a half-written equation, the numbers tangled in his mind like a knot refusing to loosen. Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker's heels clicked sharply against the tiled floor as she paced the room. Her presence was commanding, her movements deliberate. She stopped abruptly at Malik's desk, her shadow falling over his notebook like an unwelcome weight. Struggling again, Malik? Her voice was smooth, but there was a sharp edge beneath it, something meant to cut. Malik didn't look up. "No, ma'am," he said quietly, his voice steady but subdued. Mrs. Whitaker leaned closer, her perfume sharp and cloying. "Then why are you hesitating?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. Malik's grip on his pencil tightened. "I'm just checking my work," he replied softly, keeping his gaze fixed on the page. A snicker erupted from the front row, a sound that cut through the quiet like a knife. Mrs. Whitaker straightened and turned toward the board, her heels clicking again as she walked away. "Well then," she said, picking up a piece of chalk and writing in bold letters across the board, challenge question. She turned back to Malik with a faint smirk. "Let's see if you can handle this." The room fell silent as every eye turned toward Malik. He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back. His chest tightened as he walked toward the board, but his expression remained calm, determined. Malik Johnson stood at the front of the classroom, his hands slightly damp as he picked up the chalk. The equation on the board was sprawling, complex, designed to intimidate. Mrs. Whitaker stepped back, crossing her arms, her smirk unwavering. "Take your time," she said, her tone syrupy but laced with expectation. The classroom buzzed softly with whispers. "He's going to mess it up. Why'd she even pick him?" Malik tuned them out, his focus narrowing to the numbers in front of him. He stared at the equation for a moment, his mind racing through possible solutions. His father's voice echoed faintly in his memory. "Numbers. Don't lie, Malik. They're just waiting for someone brave enough to listen." He began writing slowly, his movements deliberate. The chalk squeaked against the board as he mapped out his process step by step. The whispers faded into silence as the classroom watched, their pens frozen mid-air. Mrs. Whitaker's smile faltered slightly as Malik's solution took shape. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "That's not the method I taught," she said sharply. Malik paused but didn't turn around. "It's valid," he replied calmly, continuing to write. Her knuckles whitened around the grading pen she held tightly in her hand. "Explain your steps," she demanded, her voice clipped. Malik finished writing and stepped back slightly, dusting chalk from his fingers. "It's a variation of the quadratic formula," he said evenly. "It simplifies the process." A student in the back pulled out their phone discreetly and began recording as Mrs. Whitaker's expression hardened further. Malik turned toward her briefly, meeting her gaze for a fleeting moment before walking back to his seat in silence. Malik sat down at his desk, his hands resting lightly on the edge of his notebook. The chalkboard behind him now displayed a flawless solution, the sprawling equation reduced to its simplest form. The classroom was silent, heavier than it had been moments ago. Mrs. Whitaker stood frozen near the board, her gaze fixed on the answer. Her smirk was gone, replaced by something unreadable. Shock, perhaps, or disbelief. Her fingers twitched, slightly around the grading pen she still held, as if she were trying to steady herself. The whispers that had filled the room earlier were gone. Students exchanged glances but said nothing, their eyes darting between Malik and Mrs. Whitaker's. Fly buzzed against the window, its faint hum the only sound in the room. Malik's chest rose and fell steadily as he stared at his notebook, refusing to look up. Mrs. Whitaker cleared her throat, breaking the silence with a forced cough. "Well," she began, her voice strained but trying to regain control. "It seems you've managed to find an answer." Malik didn't respond. His pencil tapped softly against the desk as he flipped to a blank page in his notebook. The door creaked open suddenly, drawing everyone's attention. A student stepped in late, their face flushed with embarrassment. They froze when they saw the tension in the room and quickly slid into their seat without a word. In the back row, a student lifted their phone discreetly and snapped a photo of the board, a moment frozen in time. Malik's quiet triumph and Mrs. Whitaker's stunned silence captured in one frame. Malik sat still at his desk, his notebook open to a blank page. The chalkboard behind him gleamed with the solution he had written, a flawless answer to what Mrs. Whitaker had called unsolvable. The air in the room felt dense, as though everyone was holding their breath at once. Mrs. Whitaker remained, near the board, her knuckles white as she gripped her grading pen tightly. She stared at the solution, her lips pressed into a thin line. The confidence she had displayed earlier was gone, replaced by an uneasy silence that she couldn't seem to break. The classroom was frozen in place. Students exchanged glances, but didn't dare speak. Even the usual hum of whispers and quiet laughter had vanished, leaving only the faint ticking of the clock above the door. Malik's calm demeanor didn't falter as he flipped through his notebook, pretending to focus on something else. He felt the weight of every gaze on him, some curious, some impressed, and others unsure how to react. Mrs. Whitaker finally turned away from the board, her movements stiff and mechanical. She cleared her throat again, louder this time, as if trying to reassert control over the room. "Well," she said sharply, her voice cracking slightly before she steadied it, "I suppose that's one way to approach it." Malik didn't look up. He simply nodded once, his expression unreadable. A fly buzzed against the window pane, its faint hum cutting through the silence like a blade. Mrs. Whitaker glanced toward it briefly before turning back to her desk, her heels clicking loudly against the floor as she walked away. The bell rang, but no one moved. The tension in the classroom lingered like a heavy fog. Malik Johnson quietly packed his notebook into his backpack, his movements calm and deliberate. His eyes remained fixed on his desk, avoiding the chalkboard and Mrs. Whitaker entirely. In the back row, Jake, a student known for capturing moments on his phone, stared at the screen in disbelief. The video he had recorded, Malik solving the unsolvable equation, was already uploaded. A notification popped up. Posted 15 seconds ago. He refreshed the page and the views skyrocketed from 50 to 500 within moments. Jake whispered to the student next to him, "It's blowing up." Mrs. Whitaker stood stiffly at her desk, her grading pen untouched beside her planner. Her gaze flickered toward Malik as he slung his backpack over one shoulder and walked toward the door. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but hesitated. Her words caught somewhere between pride and embarrassment. Malik paused briefly at the door, turning slightly to glance at her. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, a look that carried more weight than any words could have. Malik's expression was calm, unyielding, while Mrs. Whitaker's was strained, her confidence visibly shaken. Jake's phone buzzed again. 100 shares. The video caption read, "Quiet kid solves impossible problem. Teacher speechless." As Malik stepped into the hallway, the classroom erupted into murmurs and whispers. Students leaned toward one another, their voices hushed but urgent. "Did you see how she froze? I didn't think he'd actually do it." Mrs. Whitaker sank into her chair slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for her planner but didn't open it. Mrs. Whitaker's classroom was eerily quiet, stripped of the life it once held. The posters she had carefully hung over the years were gone, leaving behind faint outlines on the walls where tape had peeled the paint. The motivational quotes she had framed sat stacked in a box near the door, their glass surfaces reflecting the emptiness of the room. Her desk was bare. No papers, no pens, no personal items. The nameplate that once proudly displayed Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker had been tossed into a donation box outside the faculty lounge. A custodian swept the floor in silence, his broom scraping softly against the tiles as he worked to erase the last traces of her presence. Mrs. Whitaker stood near the window, staring out at the parking lot where students gathered in small groups, laughing and chatting as if nothing had changed. Her reflection in the glass was faint, distorted by streaks left behind from an earlier rainstorm. She turned slowly and walked toward her desk, her heels clicking against the floor with each step. She placed her hand on its surface, running her fingers over the smooth wood as if searching for something familiar, something that wasn't there anymore. The door creaked open behind her, and she turned sharply to see the custodian standing in the doorway. He hesitated before speaking. "They said you can leave whenever you're ready," he said softly, avoiding her gaze. Mrs. Whitaker nodded but didn't respond. She picked up her bag from the chair and slung it over her shoulder, her movements slow and deliberate. As she stepped out of the room, she glanced back one last time at the empty desk, a symbol of everything she had lost. The school cafeteria buzzed with the usual lunchtime chaos, students laughing, trays clattering, and conversations overlapping. But at one table in the corner, Jake sat hunched over his phone, his fingers shaking as he refreshed the screen. The video he had posted just hours earlier was spreading faster than he'd imagined. It showed Malik Johnson standing calmly at the drawing chalkboard, solving Mrs. Whitaker's unsolvable problem with precision. The camera had captured everything: the quiet determination in Malik's movements, the stunned silence of the class, and Mrs. Whitaker's frozen expression as her authority crumbled before their eyes. Jake's phone vibrated again. Another notification popped up. 100K views. He stared at the number in disbelief. Comments flooded in beneath the video. They tried to humiliate him. He humiliated their system instead. "This happened to my brother last year." "Same." "Teacher, Malik Johnson is a genius. Protect him at all costs." Jake glanced around nervously, unsure of how to process the attention his post was receiving. Across the room, Malik sat alone at his usual spot, quietly eating his lunch and flipping through his notebook as if nothing had changed. Students whispered as they passed him, their eyes lingering on him longer than usual. Mrs. Whitaker walked into the cafeteria, her heels clicking sharply against the tiles. The noise softened as students turned to watch her. She scanned the room briefly and spotted Malik in the corner. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't approach him. Instead, she turned abruptly and exited through another door. Jake refreshed his phone again. The views had climbed to 150K. He hesitated for a moment before typing a caption for his next post. "Quiet kid solves impossible problem. Teacher speechless." He hit send and placed his phone down slowly, realizing this was only the beginning. The CD sound of chalk scratching against the board faded from Malik's memory as he sat on his bed that evening, staring at the folded napkin in his hands. The edges were worn and frayed, the ink faded but still legible. On it was an equation, one his father had scribbled years ago during a late-night diner visit. Malik closed his eyes, and the memory came rushing back. He was 8 years old, sitting in a booth with his father at their favorite diner. The smell of coffee and pancakes filled the air as his father grabbed a napkin and a pen, grinning as he drew numbers and symbols across the paper. "Math is your superpower," his father had said, sliding the napkin toward Malik. "You see this? Numbers don't care where you're from or what you look like. They just need someone brave enough to solve them." Malik had smiled then, his small hands tracing the symbols on the napkin as if they held some kind of magic. But his mother's voice had cut through the moment, soft but firm. "Don't let them see it too soon." His father had sighed, leaning back in the booth. "He's got a gift," he said quietly. "And they'll find a way to punish him for it," his mother replied, her tone heavy with worry. Malik opened his eyes and unfolded the napkin again, running his fingers over the faded ink. His father was gone now, taken too soon, but those words had stayed with him. Numbers don't lie. He tucked the napkin back into his wallet, its edges sticking out slightly as if it refused to be hidden completely. He glanced at his notebook, on the desk nearby, filled with equations he hadn't shown anyone yet. "Not yet," he whispered to himself, echoing his mother's warning. Script for "The Emails That Told the Truth." 350 words. Lena Park sat in her dimly lit office, the glow of her laptop screen reflecting off her glasses. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the computer and the occasional click of her mouse. She leaned forward, scrolling through a series of emails she had obtained from an anonymous source within the school district. Her eyes narrowed as she opened one titled, Classroom Concerns. It was from Mrs. Whitaker to the principal, dated just a few weeks earlier. The words jumped out at her. Malik's aggressive focus disrupts class harmony. Lena frowned, reading it again to make sure she hadn't misinterpreted. Aggressive. Focus? She shook her head, muttering under her breath. They're weaponizing his intelligence. She clicked on another email. This one older. It was marked confidential and sent by the principal to a group of senior staff members. To maintain the integrity of our honors program, we must remain selective in our admissions process. Lena's fingers froze over the keyboard. She scrolled further down and found a reply from Mrs. Whitaker. I agree. We need to ensure that only students who fit our academic culture are included. Her stomach churned as she pieced together the implications. This wasn't about merit. It was about exclusion. Malik wasn't disrupting harmony. He was disrupting their carefully constructed narrative of who belonged in their system and who didn't. She opened yet another email, this one more blunt. His presence in advanced classes creates unnecessary tension. Lena leaned back in her chair, exhaling sharply. The evidence was damning. A decade's worth of coded language and thinly veiled prejudice laid bare in black and white. She grabbed her phone and dialed Malik's mother. When the call connected, Lena's voice was steady but urgent. I think I have what we need. The camera lingered on her laptop screen, where Mrs. Whitaker's name glowed at the top of the email chain like a scarlet letter. Lena Park sat at her desk, a stack of papers spread out before her. The school's honors program roster was neatly printed on one sheet, its columns filled with names, grades, and test scores. She flipped through the pages slowly, her pen hovering over certain lines as she cross-referenced the data with demographic reports she had pulled from public records. Her eyes stopped at a glaring statistic. 0 black students enrolled in the honors program. Not one. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the numbers as they blurred together. The school's slogan, Excellence Through Merit, was printed at the top of every page, bold and unapologetic, but the numbers told a different story. Lena grabbed her red pen and began highlighting patterns. Names repeated across multiple years. Students from wealthy families. Students who had been privately tutored since elementary school. She circled them and made notes in the margins. Legacy. Admissions? Selective bias? She flipped to another document, this one signed by the principal himself. It outlined the criteria for honors program eligibility, demonstrated academic excellence, positive contributions to classroom culture, alignment with institutional values. Lena's pen froze over the last line. Institutional values. She underlined it twice, the ink bleeding into the paper like a wound. She pulled up an email from Mrs. Whitaker on her laptop. Malik's presence in advanced classes creates unnecessary tension. The principal's response was brief, but clear. Not a good fit. Lena exhaled sharply and grabbed her phone, snapping photos of the highlighted rosters and flagged documents. She knew what this was, a system designed to exclude under the guise of meritocracy. She placed the papers into a folder labeled Evidence and whispered to herself, they can't hide this anymore. The chemistry lab was quiet, the faint smell of cleaning supplies lingering in the air. Lena Park sat at one of the long tables, her recorder placed discreetly beside her notepad. Across from her sat Emily Carter, a pale and nervous senior who avoided Lena's gaze by staring at the periodic table on the wall behind her. Emily fidgeted with the zipper on her jacket, her hands trembling slightly. I don't know if this is going to help, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. It will, Lena replied gently but firmly. Just tell me what you know. Emily swallowed hard and glanced at the door, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. Mrs. Whitaker told me to stop helping Malik, she said finally, her words tumbling out in a rush. Lena leaned forward slightly, her pen poised over her notepad. What exactly did she say? Emily hesitated, then mimicked Mrs. Whittaker's tone. He's going to embarrass himself anyway. Don't make it worse by giving him false confidence. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she looked down at her hands, ashamed. Lena's pen froze mid-sentence as she processed Emily's confession. "And did you stop helping him?" she asked quietly. Emily nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't want to, but I was scared. She made it sound like I'd get in trouble if I didn't listen." The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Lena studied Emily for a moment before speaking again. "Why are you telling me this now?" Emily wiped her eyes with her sleeve and finally met Lena's gaze. "Because he didn't embarrass himself," she said firmly. "He proved her wrong." Lena nodded slowly and turned off the recorder. "Thank you," she said softly. The principal's office was cold and sterile, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. Malik's mother, Angela Johnson, stood across from the principal's desk, her hands gripping a folder filled with past complaints. Her jaw was tight, her eyes blazing with quiet fury as she placed the folder down with a sharp thud. "You ignored these," Angela said, her voice trembling but firm. The principal, Mr. Richard Hayes, adjusted his tie nervously and glanced at the folder. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, his tone measured, "I understand your frustration, but we don't want to escalate this situation unnecessarily." Angela leaned forward slightly, her hands flat on the desk. "Escalate?" she repeated, her voice rising just enough to cut through his practiced calm. "My son solved your impossible problem, and you're worried about escalation?" Mr. Hayes cleared his throat and leaned back in his chair. "We're reviewing the matter internally," he said carefully. "Mrs. Whittaker has been a respected educator for years." Angela interrupted him, her words sharp and deliberate. "Respected? She humiliated my son in front of his peers. She tried to break him because she couldn't handle his brilliance." The room fell silent for a moment, the tension palpable. Mr. Hayes glanced at the folder again, but didn't open it. Angela straightened and crossed her arms over her chest. "This isn't just about Malik," she continued, her voice steady. "Now. It's about every black student who's been dismissed, ignored, or labeled not a good fit. You've built a system that excludes them while protecting people like Mrs. Whittaker." Mr. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but said nothing. Angela picked up the folder and turned toward the door. Before leaving, she paused and looked back at him one last time. "You don't want escalation? Then fix it," she said firmly, before walking out. The hallway outside Mrs. Whittaker's classroom was quiet, save for the faint murmur of voices coming from inside. Mr. James Carter, the school janitor, paused mid-sweep, his broom resting against the wall as he leaned closer to the slightly ajar door. Inside, Mrs. Whittaker's voice was sharp, her frustration barely contained. "This is getting out of hand," she snapped. "That boy is making a mockery of this school." The principal, Mr. Hayes, sighed audibly. "Eleanor," he said in a low tone, "this isn't just about Malik anymore. The video is everywhere. Parents are calling. Reporters are asking questions. Mrs. Whittaker cut him off, her words laced with anger. "He's just a kid. He doesn't belong in advanced classes, let alone solving problems I designed to challenge my top students." There was a pause, heavy and uncomfortable. Mr. Carter leaned closer, his heart pounding as he waited for Mr. Hayes's response. "We need to contain this," Mr. Hayes said finally, his voice clipped. "Fix it before it becomes something we can't control," Mrs. Whittaker scoffed, her heels clicking against the floor as she paced the room. "Fix it? How? By letting him think he's some kind of genius? By letting everyone believe I'm incompetent?" Mr. Carter shook his head, slowly, his grip tightening on the broom handle. He glanced down the hallway at the framed equation hanging proudly on the wall. Malik's solution immortalized for everyone to see. Inside the classroom, Mrs. Whittaker's voice softened slightly but remained bitter. "I've been here for 20 years, she said quietly. I won't let one student ruin my reputation." Mr. Carter stepped back from the door and resumed sweeping as if he hadn't heard a thing. But his gaze lingered on Malik's framed equation as he passed, the glass reflecting his own weary expression. Mrs. Whitaker sat alone in the faculty lounge, her coffee untouched on the table in front of her. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the vending machine in the corner. Her phone buzzed again, lighting up with a new notification. She glanced at the screen. It was a text from her closest friend and fellow teacher, Margaret Shaw. "Did you see the news? The video is everywhere." Mrs. Whitaker's thumb hovered over the screen, but she didn't reply. Instead, she let the message sit unread, its presence mocking her. She placed the phone face down on the table and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling as her thoughts spiraled. The video had gone viral. Malik's quiet triumph, her stunned silence, and the chalkboard that now symbolized her unraveling authority. Parents were calling, reporters were asking questions, and students whispered whenever she walked by. Her phone buzzed again, another text lighting up the screen. "Are you okay? Call me." Mrs. Whitaker picked up the phone this time, but didn't respond. She opened her email instead, scrolling through messages from concerned parents and curt notices from administration about pending reviews. Her hand trembled slightly as she clicked on one subject line. Request for explanation. Faki. Words blurred as she read them. "We need clarity on your handling of advanced students." She closed the email abruptly and set the phone down again, its screen dimming to black. Her reflection stared back at her faintly in the darkened glass, a hollow version of herself that she barely recognized. The lounge door opened briefly as another teacher walked in, glanced at her awkwardly, and left without a word. Mrs. Whitaker's shoulders slumped further as she reached for her coffee, but didn't drink it. Malik sat on the edge of his bed, his laptop open on his knees. The faint glow of the screen lit up his face as he scrolled through post after post. His name was everywhere, hashtags, comments, and messages flooding social media. Math While Black was trending. The video of him solving the unsolvable problem had sparked something bigger than he could have imagined. People were sharing their own stories. "This happened to me in high school. They said I didn't belong in AP classes. My son was told he wasn't a good fit. Thank you, Malik, for showing them what's possible. They tried to break him. He broke their system instead." Malik clicked on one post. A video of a young black girl solving equations in her bedroom, her notebook spread across the floor. The caption read, "Inspired by Malik Johnson. Numbers don't lie." His inbox was overflowing with messages from strangers. "You're not alone. Keep going, we're rooting for you. You gave me hope." He leaned back against the wall, letting the words sink in. For so long he had felt invisible, dismissed and underestimated by teachers like Mrs. Whitaker, but now people were listening. His quiet defiance had become a rallying cry for others who had been silenced. Malik opened a folder on his laptop and began saving screenshots of the posts and messages. He labeled it proof. Proof that he wasn't alone. Proof that his voice mattered. Proof that change was possible. His mother knocked softly on the door and stepped in, her expression a mix of pride and concern. "You okay?" she asked gently. Malik nodded, closing the laptop but keeping it close to him. "Yeah," he said quietly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think I'm okay." The cafeteria was alive with noise, students laughing, trays clattering, and conversations overlapping. Malik sat alone at his usual spot near the corner, his notebook open in front of him. He flipped through pages filled with equations, his pencil moving lightly across the paper. Despite the chaos around him, there was a noticeable shift in the air. Students glanced at him as they walked by, their whispers barely audible but impossible to ignore. "That's him," one student murmured. "He's the one from the video." Another replied softly. Malik kept his head down, pretending not to notice. His focus remained on his notebook, though the weight of their stares pressed heavily on him. Across the room, Emily Carter hesitated near the lunch line, her tray balanced in her hands. She scanned the cafeteria until her eyes landed on Malik. Her chest tightened as she remembered Mrs. Whitaker's words. Don't help him. He'll embarrass himself anyway. Emily took a deep breath and walked toward Malik's table. Noise in the cafeteria dulled slightly as students noticed her approach. She slid her tray onto the table and sat down across from him, her movements hesitant but deliberate. I'm sorry, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Malik paused, his pencil hovering above the page. He looked up at her slowly, his expression unreadable. For what? He asked evenly. Emily swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of her tray. For listening to her, she admitted. For not standing up for you when I should have. The cafeteria seemed to hold its breath as Malik stared at her for a moment longer before nodding slightly and returning to his notebook. Trust fractured. Not forgotten. Emily sat silently, unsure if she had done enough, but knowing it was a start. Lena Park sat at her desk, the soft glow of her desk lamp illuminating the scattered papers in front of her. She was reviewing the school's honors program records when a knock at her office door startled her. She looked up to see no one there, but an envelope had been slipped under the door. She picked it up cautiously, flipping it over in her hands. There was no name, no return address, just the words for Lena Park written in neat block letters. She opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was shaky but legible. Check the 2018 parent-teacher logs. Beneath it was a story that made Lena's stomach turn. My daughter was removed from honors math without warning. When I asked why, they said she wasn't a good fit. She cried for weeks. Please don't let them do this to anyone else. Lena leaned back in her chair, the weight of the message settling over her. She reached for her laptop and began searching through archived records from 2018. It didn't take long to find what she was looking for, a complaint filed by a black mother whose daughter had been removed from advanced classes despite high test scores and glowing teacher recommendations. The principal's response was brief and dismissive. Not a good fit for our academic culture. Lena clenched her jaw as she read it again, anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. She flipped through more logs and found similar complaints, parents questioning why their children were excluded, teachers defending biased decisions with vague explanations like classroom harmony or institutional values. She placed the anonymous letter beside the logs and took a deep breath. Whoever had sent it knew exactly what they were exposing, a pattern of exclusion hidden behind polite words and bureaucratic excuses. The school hallway was unusually quiet, the typical chatter of students and teachers replaced by hushed tones and stolen glances. Mrs. Whitaker walked briskly, her heels clicking against the polished tiles. She kept her head high, but her grip on the stack of papers in her arms was tight, her knuckles pale. As she passed clusters of teachers, their conversations stopped abruptly. They exchanged awkward glances before turning away, pretending to be engrossed in their schedules or phones. "Did you hear?" one teacher whispered as soon as Mrs. Whitaker was out of earshot. "She's under review," another replied softly. "The emails, the video, everything's coming out." A younger teacher leaned closer to the group, her voice barely audible. "I heard parents are demanding she resign." Mrs. Whitaker's pace quickened as she approached the faculty lounge. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, hoping for a moment of respite. But even here, the tension followed her. Two teachers sitting near the coffee machine fell silent as she entered. One of them stood abruptly, mumbling something about needing to make copies before leaving the room entirely. The other avoided eye contact, staring intently at their laptop screen as if it held the secrets of the universe. Mrs. Whitaker set her papers down on a table and sat heavily in a chair, her shoulders slumping for just a moment before she straightened. Again. She reached for her phone and opened her email inbox. Another flood of messages from parents and administrators questioning her decisions, her methods, her integrity. Outside the lounge, students walked past Malik's framed equation hanging on the wall. Some touched it reverently, others stopped to take photos. The glass gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a constant reminder of what had shifted within these walls. Mrs. Whitaker stared at her untouched coffee, the whispers from outside growing louder in her mind. The hallway was alive with quiet energy. Students passed by in small groups, their voices hushed as they approached the framed equation hanging on the wall. Malik's solution, written in bold chalk lines, had been preserved under glass, a symbol of defiance and brilliance that refused to be ignored. Some students stopped to admire it, their fingers brushing lightly against the frame as if seeking inspiration. Others snapped photos, their captions filled with hashtags like Math While Black and Breaking Barriers. The plaque beneath the frame read, Malik Johnson, Excellence Through Resilience. Mrs. Whitaker walked past the display, every morning, her heels clicking against the tiles louder than usual. She never stopped to look at it, but her gaze would flicker toward it briefly before she turned away, her movements stiff and hurried. Each day, she erased Malik's equation from her classroom chalkboard, hoping to reclaim some semblance of control. But every morning it reappeared, written by students who refused to let it fade. The chalk dust clung to her sleeves like guilt she couldn't wash away. One afternoon, she stood in front of the framed equation, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. The hallway was empty except for a janitor polishing the floor nearby. She stared at the numbers, her breathing shallow as memories of that day flooded back. The stunned silence of the classroom, Malik's calm defiance, and the viral video that had unraveled everything she thought she knew about power and authority. The janitor glanced at her briefly before returning to his work. "Beautiful. Peace," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough weight to make her flinch. Mrs. Whitaker didn't reply. She turned abruptly and walked away, her heels echoing down the hallway as the framed equation remained behind, untouched and unyielding. The auditorium was packed, every seat filled with anxious parents, teachers, and students. The air buzzed, with nervous energy, whispers darting from row to row. Malik sat between his mother and Mr. Carter, his fists clenched tightly under the table. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room, the pressure mounting with each passing second. The front, the school board chairperson raised a wooden gavel and brought it down hard on the podium. The sharp crack echoed through the hall, slicing through the murmurs and commanding instant silence. Mrs. Whitaker sat at the witness table, her blazer perfectly pressed, but her posture rigid. She glanced at her reflection in the polished wood of the podium, her features warped and uncertain. She smoothed her hair with trembling fingers, trying to steady herself. Malik's mother reached over and squeezed his hand, her grip strong and reassuring. Mr. Carter leaned in, his voice low and steady. "Whatever happens, you did what they said was impossible." Malik nodded, swallowing hard. He looked up at the board members, their faces unreadable as they shuffled papers and prepared to begin. The chairperson cleared her throat. "We are here to address recent events in the mathematics department and the concerns raised by students and parents." Her voice was formal, but there was a hint of something softer beneath the surface, a recognition of the gravity of the moment. Mrs. Whitaker adjusted her blazer again, her eyes darting nervously across the room. She caught Malik's gaze for a split second, then looked away. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Malik's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his face calm, refusing to let fear show. The chairperson raised the gavel once more. "Let's proceed." The next chapter was about to begin, and everyone in the room knew nothing would ever be the same. The silence in the auditorium was thick, every breath held as Mrs. Whitaker rose from her seat and approached the microphone. She straightened her blazer, her face composed, but her eyes darting nervously across the crowd. Malik watched her closely, his mother's hand still wrapped around his. Mr. Carter leaned in and whispered, "Watch her hands." Mrs. Whitaker gripped the edge of the podium, her knuckles white. She cleared her throat, her voice steady but lacking its usual confidence. "I treat all students equally," she began, her words echoing through the hall. "I have always believed in fairness and academic excellence." A ripple of discomfort moved through the audience. Malik's mother stiffened, her jaw set. Malik's gaze never left Mrs. Whitaker, searching for any sign of truth in her words. Mrs. Whitaker continued, "I have never discriminated against any student." My classroom is a place of opportunity for all." Her fingers trembled, betraying the calm. She tried to project. A board member leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Mrs. Whitaker, can you explain the recent events involving Malik Johnson?" She hesitated, her composure faltering for a moment. "Malik is a talented student," she said, her tone clipped. "But sometimes his focus can be disruptive." To the class environment, Mr. Carter shook his head, whispering, "There it is." Malik's mother squeezed his hand tighter, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Whitaker. The room was silent, the tension mounting with every word. Mrs. Whitaker's hands shook as she tried to steady herself, her mask of authority slipping. Malik sat, up straighter, his calm presence a quiet challenge to the narrative unfolding before him. The board chairperson nodded, signaling for the next speaker. The truth was beginning to surface, and the room could feel the shift. A hush fell over the auditorium as Mrs. Whitaker stepped back from the microphone, her words lingering in the air. Malik felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he didn't flinch. He glanced at his mother, who nodded with quiet encouragement, and then at Mr. Carter, whose steady gaze told him it was time. Malik stood slowly, his chair scraping softly against the floor. He walked to the microphone, his steps measured and sure. The room seemed to shrink around him, every eye fixed on the quiet student who had become the center of a storm. He took a breath, his voice clear but gentle. "Equal isn't the same as fair," Malik said, letting the words settle. The room froze, the impact of his statement rippling through the crowd. Mrs. Whitaker's face tightened, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. Malik continued, "I did what was asked of me. I solved the problem, but I was never given the same chance as others. That's not fairness. That's not opportunity." A murmur ran through the audience. Lena Park, seated near the front, stood abruptly and held up a flash drive. "Let's show them equal," she said, her voice ringing out. She nodded to the tech crew, who quickly connected her drive to the projector. The screen flickered to life behind Malik, casting a pale glow over the stage. Malik stepped aside, his heart pounding but his face calm. He had said what needed to be said, and now the evidence would speak for itself. The board chairperson nodded, signaling for the presentation to begin. Malik returned to his seat, his mother squeezing his hand with pride. The auditorium was silent, everyone bracing for what would come next. The lights dimmed as the projector flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow across the auditorium. Lena Park stood at the side of the stage, her face set with determination. The first email appeared on the screen, its subject line bold. "Classroom concerns." A hush fell over the crowd as Lena read aloud, her voice steady. "Malik's aggression disrupts class harmony." The words hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the audience. Mrs. Whitaker's face flushed, her lipstick smudged as she bit her lip. She looked down at her hands, fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Lena clicked to the next email. "Keep the honors program selective." The principal's name was visible at the bottom, his signature a stamp of approval. A parent in the audience stood up, voice trembling with anger. "Shame," he called out, his words echoing through the hall. Others murmured in agreement, the mood shifting from confusion to outrage. Malik sat quietly, his mother's hand resting on his shoulder. Mr. Carter leaned forward, his eyes shining with vindication. Lena continued, displaying more messages, each one a piece of the puzzle, each one exposing the quiet exclusion that had shaped the school's culture for years. The evidence was undeniable, the language clear. Malik and students like him had been kept out, not for lack of ability, but because they didn't fit. Mrs. Whitaker's composure crumbled further with every slide. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the truth settling over them. The final email faded from the screen, leaving the room in heavy silence. Lena stepped back, her job done. The auditorium was no longer just a place of judgment. It had become a place of reckoning. The silence in the auditorium was suffocating. Mrs. Whitaker sat frozen, her hands trembling in her lap as the last email faded from the screen. The board members whispered among themselves, their faces grave. Parents in the audience exchanged glances, some angry, some simply stunned. A single student's voice broke the stillness. "Apologize?" The word rang out, sharp and clear, echoing off the walls. Mrs. Whitaker's breath caught. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her heels clicked rapidly as she stumbled back from the podium, the sound frantic and uneven, nothing like the confident stride she once carried through these halls. She tried to compose herself, but her face was streaked with tears, her lipstick smeared. She looked out at the sea of faces, students she'd taught, parents she'd reassured, colleagues who now looked away. Another voice, softer but no less powerful, called out, "You owe him more than silence." Mrs. Whitaker's eyes darted to Malik, who sat quietly, his expression unreadable. His mother's arm was wrapped protectively around his shoulders. Mr. Carter watched, his gaze steady and unblinking. Unable to find her words, Mrs. Whitaker turned and shoved open the exit door. Sunlight flooded the space, momentarily blinding her as she stepped outside. The door slammed shut behind her, the echo reverberating through the auditorium like a final verdict. Outside, she paused, her chest heaving. The world felt too bright, too exposed. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, but the tears kept coming. Inside, the silence lingered, heavy and unresolved. Malik's classmates watched the door, some in shock, others in quiet relief. The power in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The door's echo faded, leaving the auditorium in a hush that felt almost sacred. The board members sat in a tight row at the front, their faces drawn and serious. The chairperson cleared her throat, her voice softer now, but resolute. "We will now vote on the motion to audit the honors program and review all exclusionary practices." A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd. Malik's mother squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. Mr. Carter sat forward, his hands clasped tightly, hope and vindication mingling in his gaze. The board members raised their hands one by one. Each vote felt like a stone dropped in a still pond, sending waves through the room. The chairperson looked out over the audience. "The motion passes unanimously." A collective exhale swept through the auditorium. Malik's mother pulled him into a fierce hug, her tears finally breaking free and soaking his shirt. Malik closed, his eyes letting himself feel the relief, the validation, the quiet pride that came from standing his ground. Mr. Carter leaned over, his voice low but full of conviction. "We're just starting, Malik. This is only the beginning." Lena Park, standing at the back, caught Malik's eye and nodded. She knew the fight wasn't over, but tonight, truth had won around. Parents in the audience began to clap, slowly at first, then louder, until the room was filled with applause. Some students joined in, their faces alight with something new, possibility. The board chairperson stood, her voice carrying over the applause. "Thank you all for your courage and honesty. Change begins with moments like this." Malik looked around, seeing not just the faces of those who doubted him, but also those who now believed. For the first time he felt seen. The next morning, the school felt different. The usual rush of students in the hallway was quieter, more thoughtful. At the center of it all, a new display had appeared, Malik's equation, the one that had changed. Everything was now framed and mounted on the main corridor wall. The chalk lines were preserved under glass, every number and symbol clear and bold. Students gathered around the memorial, some reaching out to touch the glass as if hoping a little of Malik's courage might rub off on them. Others took photos, sharing them online with captions like "History in the Making" and "Proof that Silence Can Be Broken." The plaque beneath the frame read, "Solutions over Silence," in honor of Malik Johnson's resilience and brilliance. Malik walked past the display on his way to class, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He paused for a moment, watching as a younger student traced the outline of the equation with her finger. She looked up at him, eyes wide with admiration. Malik offered a small, reassuring smile before moving on, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. A few steps away, the janitor polished the plaque, his movements slow and careful. He glanced at Malik and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had changed. The hallway, once a place of whispers and exclusion, now felt like a space where possibility lived. Teachers passed by, some pausing to read the inscription, others simply walking on, their expressions thoughtful. Even those who had once doubted Malik now saw the impact of his quiet defiance. The framed equation became more than just a symbol of one student's victory. It was a reminder to everyone that truth once revealed could not be erased, and for Malik, it was proof that dignity and resilience could leave a mark no one could ignore. The faculty lounge, once filled with laughter and casual conversation, now felt hollow. Mrs. Whitaker's mug sat unwashed on the counter, the name fading from its label. The room was quiet, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Teachers came and went, their voices low, their glances quick and uneasy. Mrs. Whitaker's desk in the corner was empty, the drawers left open and bare. A stack of lesson plans, once meticulously organized, had been cleared away. Her chair, pushed in neatly, looked untouched for days. The absence was palpable. Her presence, once commanding, now reduced to a memory and a fading name on a coffee cup. Colleagues whispered as they passed through the lounge. "Did you hear about the vote?" one asked, voice barely above a whisper. "She's not coming back," another replied, shaking their head. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. A young teacher entered, clutching a resignation letter. She paused at the principal's office door, then slipped the envelope onto his chair before leaving without a word. The gesture was quiet, but powerful, a sign that the old ways were no longer welcome. The lounge door creaked open again, and for a moment everyone looked up, expecting Mrs. Whitaker. But it was only the janitor, coming to collect the last of her things. He picked up the mug, turning it over in his hands before placing it gently in a box. As he left, the room fell silent once more. The teachers returned to their routines, but the atmosphere had shifted. The space that once belonged to Mrs. Whitaker now felt open, uncertain, and ready for something new. Outside, the sound of students laughing in the hallway drifted in, a reminder that life was moving forward. The empty lounge stood as a quiet testament to change, proof that even the most powerful can be left behind. Mrs. Whitaker stood alone in her old classroom, the morning sun casting long shadows across the empty desks. The air was thick with dust and memories. She stared at the chalkboard, where Malik's equation had been written and rewritten so many times it seemed to haunt the room. Her hand trembled as she picked up the eraser, determined to wipe away the last trace of what had happened. She pressed the eraser to the board, scrubbing hard. Chalk dust clouded her blouse, clinging to her sleeves and settling in the creases of her hands. Each swipe felt heavier than the last, as if she were trying to erase not just numbers, but the story that had unraveled her authority. The silence was broken only by the soft squeak of the eraser and her own uneven breathing. When the board was finally clean, Mrs. Whitaker stepped back, her chest heaving. She looked around the room, searching for the confidence she once carried, but finding only emptiness. She gathered her things, just a few personal items left behind, and walked out, closing the door softly behind her. The next morning, students arrived to find something new. Malik's equation, bold and unmistakable, had been spray-painted across the parking lot in bright, defiant letters. It was impossible to ignore. Every student, teacher, and parent saw it as they entered the building. The message was clear. The truth could not be erased. Mrs. Whitaker, driving past in her car, saw the equation from her window. She slowed, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. For a moment, she considered stopping, but instead she kept driving. The image of the equation burned into her memory. Inside the school, students gathered around the parking lot, snapping photos and sharing them online. Malik's legacy had become more than a moment. It was a movement. The library was filled with a quiet energy, sunlight streaming through tall windows and casting warm patterns across the tables. Malik sat at the far end, surrounded by a small group of freshmen, their notebooks open and pencils poised. He leaned over a page, his voice calm and steady as he explained a tricky equation. The students listened intently, their eyes wide with curiosity and hope. A black girl, her hair pulled back in a neat braid, slid a sheet of paper across the table. At the top, in bold letters, she had written, "Impossible." Malik glanced at the problem, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He circled the answer with a flourish and slid the paper back to her. "Nothing's impossible," he said quietly, meeting her gaze. The girl grinned, her confidence blooming in that small moment. Around them, the other students nodded, encouraged by Malik's calm certainty, the line of students waiting for his. Help grew longer. Notebooks and textbooks clutched to their chests. Some were there for math, others just to be near someone who had changed the school's story. Malik moved from table to table, offering advice, encouragement, and the occasional joke. His presence was steady, his words gentle but firm. Outside the library, the spray-painted equation in the parking lot was still visible, a daily reminder of what had been overcome. Teachers who once doubted Malik now sent students his way, quietly, acknowledging the shift that had taken place. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, Malik packed up his things. The girl with the braid caught his arm as he stood. "Thank you," she whispered. Malik smiled, his heart full. He glanced back at the library, at the students still working, and realized his legacy wasn't just an equation on a wall or a video online. It was the belief he'd sparked in others, the proof that together they could solve anything. Mrs. Whitaker's classroom was a shell of what it once had been. The walls, once covered in colorful posters and motivational quotes, were now bare, the tape marks still visible where her favorite sayings had hung. Her desk, always meticulously organized, sat empty in the corner. The nameplate that had carried her authority for years was gone, tossed into a donation box outside the main office. A custodian moved quietly through the room, sweeping up the last bits of chalk dust and stray paper clips. He worked with a gentle efficiency, careful not to disturb the silence that had settled over the space. The only sound was the soft scrape of the broom against the floor, a final act of erasure. Mrs. Whitaker stood in the doorway for a moment, her hand resting on the frame. She looked around, searching for something familiar, but found only emptiness. The room felt smaller now, stripped of the power and presence she once commanded. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the vacant space. She ran her fingers along the edge of the desk, remembering the years spent here, teaching, grading, believing she was in control. Now, all that remained was a hollow quiet. The custodian paused, meeting her eyes for a brief moment. There was no judgment, only a silent understanding that things had changed. Mrs. Whitaker nodded once, then turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind her. As she disappeared down the hallway, the custodian finished his work, sweeping away the last traces of her presence. The classroom was ready for a new beginning, its history lingering only in memory. Mrs. Whitaker stepped into the hallway, her shoes clicking softly against the polished tiles. The corridor, once a place where she greeted students and exchanged pleasantries with colleagues, now felt foreign. As she walked, students parted to let her pass, their conversations fading into uneasy whispers. Some looked away. Others watched her with a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. She kept her gaze forward, her posture rigid, but her eyes couldn't help drifting to the framed equation hanging on the wall. Malik's solution, preserved behind glass, stood as a silent testament to everything that had changed. The numbers were bold, the chalk lines unbroken, a reminder of the moment her authority had slipped away. Mrs. Whitaker's breath caught as she passed the display. She quickly looked away, focusing on the end of the hallway. The weight of the students' stares pressed on her shoulders, heavier than any stack of paper she'd ever carried. A group of teachers stood near the faculty lounge, their conversation halting as she approached. They offered polite nods, but no words, their silence louder than any greeting. Mrs. Whitaker nodded back, her lips pressed into a thin line, and continued walking. Each step felt slower, the distance to the exit stretching longer than she remembered. The school that had once felt like her domain now seemed to shrink around her, every corner echoing with memories she could no longer claim. As she reached the doors at the end of the hall, Mrs. Whitaker paused for a moment, glancing back at the framed equation one last time. Then, with a quiet sigh, she pushed open the door and stepped outside, the sound of her footsteps fading into the afternoon air. The faculty lounge was nearly empty, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. Mrs. Whitaker sat alone, at a small table, a blank sheet of paper in front of her, and a pen resting in her hand. She stared at the page for a long time, her mind racing with memories, years of teaching, moments of pride, and the recent days of silence and shame. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen. She hesitated, searching for the right words, but, in the end, she kept it simple. She wrote her name at the top, then the words, "Effective immediately, I resign." The letters were small and neat, but the meaning was heavy. She folded the letter carefully, pressing the crease with her thumb. For a moment, she just sat there, the paper clutched tightly in her hand. The voices of other teachers drifted in, from the hallway, but no one entered the lounge. The room felt colder than usual, the silence pressing in from all sides. Mrs. Whitaker stood and walked to the principal's office, her steps slow and deliberate. She paused at the door, listening to the muffled sounds of the school beyond. Then she opened it quietly, placed the letter on the principal's desk, and closed the door behind her, without a word. As she walked back through the empty lounge, she glanced at her old coffee mug sitting on the counter, the name nearly faded from the side. She left it there, a small piece of her past she no longer needed. With her resignation delivered, Mrs. Whitaker stepped out of the lounge, her shoulders lighter but her heart heavy, knowing she could never return to the life she once knew. Whitaker walked out of the building, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the nearly deserted parking lot. Her car sat alone in the far corner, the only vehicle left as the school day faded into evening. She moved slowly, her bag slung over her shoulder, the resignation letter still fresh in her mind. Each step across the asphalt felt heavier than the last. She glanced back at the school, its windows glowing softly in the fading light. For years, this place had been her world, a place of certainty, routine, and authority. Now it felt distant, almost unrecognizable. She reached her car and paused, gripping the steering wheel with both hands before unlocking the door. Sliding into the driver's seat, she sat for a moment, staring at the building through the windshield. Her knuckles turned white as she squeezed the wheel, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. Memories flashed through her mind. The laughter of students, the pride of seeing them succeed, the sting of recent failures. She wiped her eyes quickly, unwilling to let herself break down completely. The parking lot was silent. The only sound was the faint hum of traffic in the distance. Taking a deep breath, Mrs. Whitaker started the engine. She looked at the school one last time, her heart aching with regret and loss. With a final glance at the empty lot around her, she put the car in gear and drove away, the building shrinking in her rearview mirror. As she turned onto the main road, the weight of her choices settled over her. The school, the students, the framed equation in the hallway. All of it was behind her now. The future was uncertain, but there was no going back. The library was filled with a gentle hush, sunlight streaming through tall windows and casting soft patterns across the tables. Malik sat at a round table near the back, surrounded by a small group of younger students. Their notebooks were open, pencils poised, eyes fixed on him with a mix of curiosity and admiration. He explained a complex equation, his voice calm and patient. "You just have to break it down, step by step," he said, drawing lines and numbers on a scrap of paper. The students leaned in, following every move, their confidence growing with each answer. A girl with braids, no older than 12, raised her hand hesitantly. "Can I be like you someday?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Malik paused, looking at her with a gentle smile. He remembered the feeling of being overlooked, of sitting in the back of the classroom hoping someone would notice his potential. Now he was the one others looked up to. He nodded. "Of course you can," he replied. "You just have to believe in yourself, even when others don't." The girl smiled shyly, her eyes shining with hope. Around the table, the other students nodded, encouraged by Malik's quiet confidence. As the session ended, the students gathered their things, thanking Malik before heading out. He watched them go, a sense of pride settling over him. The library, once a place where he hid from the world, had become a space where he could help others find their voice. Malik packed up his notebook, glancing at the sunlight streaming through the window. He knew the journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the last of the younger students gathered their things, Malik remained at the table, quietly organizing his notes. The girl with braids lingered, her notebook clutched to her chest. She hesitated, then slid it across the table to him, a hopeful look in her eyes. Malik opened the notebook and saw a page filled with numbers and symbols, a new equation she'd tried to solve on her own. He studied it for a moment, then smiled warmly. "You already are," he said, circling her answer and writing a small note of encouragement in the margin. The girl's face lit up, her confidence blooming in that instant. Around them, the other students watched, their notebooks open and ready. Malik glanced at their eager faces and realized that the real lesson wasn't just about solving equations, it was about believing that they could. He leaned forward, sharing a simple trick for tackling tough problems. The students listened intently, their pencils moving quickly as they copied his steps. The room is filled with quiet determination, the kind that grows when someone finally feels seen. As the session ended, the students closed their notebooks, their pages now filled with solutions that once seemed impossible. They thanked Malik, their voices soft but sincere, and left the library with a new sense of purpose. Malik watched them go, a gentle pride settling over him. He knew that the equation on the wall was just the beginning. The real change was happening here, in these small moments of encouragement and belief. He packed up his things, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the legacy he was building was bigger than any single answer. The school's main hallway had become a place of quiet reverence. Each morning, students paused in front of the framed equation, Malik's solution, preserved behind glass. Some reached out to touch the frame, their fingers brushing the cool surface as if drawing strength from the numbers. Others whispered words of encouragement to themselves, inspired by what the equation represented. Malik's name was etched beneath the glass in bold letters, "Breaking Barriers." The plaque was more than a tribute. It was a promise that things could change, that silence could be broken, and that every student's potential deserved to be seen. Teachers walked by, some pausing to read the inscription, others simply nodding, in acknowledgement. Even those who had once doubted Malik now recognized the impact of his quiet determination. The hallway, once filled with whispers and exclusion, now echoed with hope and possibility. Malik walked past the display on his way to class, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He caught the eye of a younger student who stood staring at the equation, awe written across his face. Malik offered a small, reassuring smile, and the boy smiled back, standing a little taller. The framed equation became a daily reminder that change was possible, that one act of courage could ripple through an entire community. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of standing up, even when your voice shakes. As Malik continued down the hallway, he felt the weight of the past begin to lift. The legacy he had created was no longer just his own. It belonged to everyone who believed that barriers could be broken, and that every student deserves a chance to shine. Principal Hayes stood just outside the library, his hands clasped behind, his back as he watched through the glass door. Inside, Malik was surrounded by students, their faces bright with curiosity and hope. Hayes saw the way Malik explained each problem, the patience in his voice, the way the younger students leaned in, eager to learn. He adjusted his tie, feeling a knot of regret tighten in his chest. For years he had signed off on policies and decisions that kept students like Malik on the outside, always justifying it as maintaining standards or protecting classroom harmony. Now, watching Malik lead with quiet confidence, Hayes realized how much potential had been overlooked. He remembered the emails, the complaints from parents, the warnings from teachers like Mrs. Whitaker. He had dismissed them, thinking he was doing what was best for the school. But the framed equation in the hallway, the students gathered around Malik, and the shift in the school's atmosphere told a different story. Hayes sighed, his reflection faint in the glass. He knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but it had to start somewhere. He made a silent promise to himself to listen more, to look beyond the surface, and to make space for every student's voice. As Malik finished his session and the students filed out, Hayes stepped back, letting the door close quietly behind him. He walked down the hallway, past the framed equation, and paused for a moment, reading the inscription, "Breaking Barriers." The words stayed with him as he continued on, a reminder that leadership meant more than authority. It meant the courage to admit when you were wrong, and the resolve to do better. Outside the school, the afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the parking lot as parents gathered in small groups waiting for their children. The usual chatter about homework and after-school plans was replaced by quiet conversations about the changes happening inside the building. There was a new energy in the air, one of hope, curiosity, and cautious optimism. A mother leaned against her car, watching the doors as students streamed out. She turned to the woman beside her and spoke softly. "It feels different here now, doesn't it?" Her friend nodded, a gentle smile on her face. "It feels right, like something finally shifted." Nearby, a father scrolled through his phone, pausing on a photo of the framed equation in the hallway. He showed it to his daughter, pride shining in his eyes. "That's what happens when you stand up for what's right," he said. She grinned, hugging her backpack a little tighter. Parents who had once questioned the school's direction now found themselves talking about Malik's story, about the courage it took to speak up, and about the importance of giving every student a fair chance. The conversations were honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but always hopeful. As the last bell rang, teachers stepped outside, joining the parents in the afternoon light. There were more smiles, more nods of recognition, and a sense of community. That hadn't been there before. The school, once divided by silence and suspicion, was beginning to heal. Malik walked out of the building, his head held high. He caught snippets of the conversations, words like change, proud, and future. For the first time, he felt the support of not just his classmates, but the entire community. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in soft gold and pink, Malik stepped out of the library with his backpack slung over one shoulder. The halls were quiet now, the day's noise replaced by a gentle hush. He paused by the framed equation in the main hallway, the glass catching the last light of the day. He stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The bold numbers, his name etched beneath, and the plaque that read, "Breaking Barriers." Students and teachers had passed by this spot all day, some pausing to reflect, others simply nodding in respect. Malik traced the edge of the frame with his finger, feeling the cool glass beneath his touch. A few students lingered nearby, whispering about their own dreams and challenges. Malik caught their eyes and offered a faint, reassuring smile. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of everything he'd endured and everything he'd overcome. He turned and walked toward the exit, the fading sunlight casting his shadow long across the floor. As he stepped outside, the air felt lighter, filled with the promise of new beginnings. The school behind him was changed, not just by what he had done, but by the courage he had inspired in others. Malik glanced back one last time, his smile growing a little wider. He knew his journey wasn't over, but he also knew he had left something lasting behind, a legacy of resilience, hope, and quiet strength. The camera lingered on his retreating figure, the framed equation glowing in the hallway as the story of Malik Johnson continued to ripple outward, touching lives he'd never even met.